So welcome everyone to the online viewing room, conversation room. We are welcoming you to the second edition of this conversation room online and the 47th edition of FIAC happening at the Grand Palais Éphémère. I'm going to pass on the hand to Zain Masud, the moderator today, to introduce the panelists and start the conversation.
I'm delighted to have
you so much.
Thank you, Victoria. Thank you for the kind introduction. And I'd like to extend our thanks to FIAC for hosting us today, and to Jennifer Flay and Charlotte Ardon for the invitation to participate in a conversation room. We're really honored to be here. Good morning, everybody. I'm going to offer just a little by way of introduction, as we have much to launch into with our speakers today, and I anticipate a revealing conversation. Patronage and authentic models for institutions, representation and capacity building for the field of art and culture are an area of need and some urgency in the region of South Asia, where the commitment of private patrons is critical to addressing and breaching broad gaps, particularly where public and federal support is lacking. So it's a privilege and my pleasure to have Smriti Rajgharia and Sabih Ahmed, stellar practitioners with pioneering institutions, Serendipity Art Foundation and Festival, and Ishara Art Foundation, who will be sharing their insights and how they approach these areas through their work. I think we should start with hearing a little bit about Serendipity Art Foundation and Festival and Ishara Art Foundation, respectively. So allow you both to the stage.
Sabih, I think you should go first. I was gonna...
Go on, Sabih, take it away.
You need to unmute yourself, Sabih.
Sorry, thank you. Thank you, Zain, for the kind introduction, and thank you to the FIAC team, who is not visible right now, but there are lots of people who went behind organizing this. Pleasure to be here. So by way of introduction, the Ishara Art Foundation, we're a nonprofit art space that is situated in Dubai. The space was founded in 2019 by our founder and chairperson, Smriti Prabhakar, who's an art collector and a businesswoman who's been based in Dubai for the past 40 years. And as an art foundation, a lot of our goal is to present contemporary art from South Asia and South Asian diaspora. But while we do that, we want to have a lot of critical dialogue around that. And we do this not just through exhibitions, but also through programming. We are aiming to open a reading space. We aim at bringing together collaborations and projects. And all of this together really is aspiring to creating Ishara more like a resource, so that in certain parts of the world, especially in the Gulf region, what you see is a large traffic of people moving across continents and really transiting here. And how can a space such as this, which is a hub for such movement, become a resource and a transit point for also new thought, thinking about new ways of perceiving and apprehending the world. So we do this curatorially, and I think we'll talk more about the foundation as we go further. So let me stop there.
My name is Smriti. As Zain said, thank you, FIAC, for inviting us here today. It's very interesting to present a worldview which is from our part of the world. Serendipity Arts Foundation was founded in 2014. And when we started the foundation, our founder patron, Mr. Sunil Kant Munjal, and that's a similarity that I and Sabih have. We both have patrons who really believe that art can bring about positive change in society. We started as a foundation, as a grant-giving body, but we realized that we wanted to show impact with the arts. Given that we're based in India in New Delhi, we kind of embarked on a festival in Goa to see what kind of economies, what kind of cultural changes can be brought through the arts. We are a curatorial-led practice like Sabih is also, but we have a slightly different model. We feel that Serendipity Arts is more of a platform to springboard newer artistic practices. We want to see how the publics can engage with the arts at a much more stronger level, and how we can introduce new audiences to this world of arts. And I'll stop there. I hope that's okay, Zain.
That's perfect. Because now you can tell us a little bit more about Sunil and about Smita, because I think it's interesting to think about what inspired them to commit at this level of patronage. There are other very generous and committed patrons across the region, but what they're doing is very specific. And I'd love to hear more about what you believe inspired them to take a leap from wider forms of philanthropy, collecting, to this level of foundational commitment.
So Mr. Munjal is someone I met about 8 years ago when I started the foundation. He invited me to start a foundation, and I thought, you know, he's another philanthropist who wants to give back to society with grants. Soon did I realize that he had the business sense to understand scale, and scale is often missing with art foundations. And I think that's really been his intrinsic contribution to the arts community in India. And I say that very proudly, because the way he's told us to think about art is almost like the soft power of the country. And what can it do to bring the regions around together? It's never only been about the act of creating an event, but what is really the impact that comes out of it. At the end of the day, we're all working towards a better society, a better change. Mr. Munjal was a collector for 40 years. He runs another very successful foundation in Ludhiana, which is in Punjab. For 25 years, they ran a community theatre space, which has free shows for the community to engage with. And so when we started the festival, he wanted to take it beyond boundaries and beyond borders. And we'll touch upon that in the questions that follow. But I just feel that with his vision as a patron is why we have the success. And I think it's a model of philanthropy that needs to be looked at more closely, where it is not about collecting or acquisition, but it becomes about giving back, not to just the artistic community that will actually be a part of your museums in the future, but also start dictating how messaging is put across through artistic practice.
Actually, with Smriti also, it's rather similar. It's about giving back to the community. Now, where it becomes a little unique in the case of Ishara is not just giving back to the community in India, but also giving back to the community here in this part of the world. And since Smriti has been based here for the past 40 years, she has made this her second home. Ishara really is a space which is looking at what is the place of the home in the world, especially in a world where the home is such a complex phenomena and site right now. No one has just one single home. If you think about it, migration in a sense is a contemporary condition. People have moved cities, villages, continents. And so the idea of home going back is just so much more complicated. And I think therefore giving back is so much more complicated. Where do you give and how do you give? So Ishara therefore came up as a space where Smriti's own interest in art and how art can be a space for conversations, inspirations, all of those kinds of potentialities is where I think she decided to come up with a foundation here in the UAE as really a place for assembling people, assembling ideas, and being a platform for seeing contemporary art from South Asia, which is circulating all the world over. So I think it comes from a similar impulse of giving back to communities.
And is there a sense?
Sorry. I was going to say, I think 40 is the magic number, right? They both have been in the space for 40 years as collectors. And I think they've kind of understood what next step they need to take with philanthropy to make sure that the community engagement kind of takes forward. Sorry, I just realized that they both have been doing this for now 40 years. It was...
So our 40 is, Smriti has been based in Dubai for 40, her collection practice took on a serious turn in 20. So we're meeting halfway somewhere.
We're meeting halfway.
And in terms of, is there a sense now in terms of what comes next in community engagement? Also the idea that there's a potential to lead by example at a different level of community, the community of peers who are charitable, philanthropic, maybe commit to education, to health. These are areas that people generally give first. And I know that Mr. Munjal, for instance, his family has supported universities, and there's a lot of this. But is there a sense of leading by example now and a consciousness about that? Because neither of your institutions have taken the family name, which is unusual in our region. Was there a purpose to that? And yeah, were there reasons? Is there a meaning?
I remember when Smriti narrates the story that when she brought together a group of friends and people she looks up to for setting together an advisory board for Ishara, by then the name Ishara was not already finalized. And so some of the advisory members were asking her, so what do you want to call this foundation? And when she said, whatever it is, it's not going to be my name, there was a big sigh of relief in the room. And then she said she's thinking about this, the name Ishara. And she's been someone who's very close to artistic practices, and Zarina is one of them, Zarina Hashmi. And the logo from one of Zarina's works, Home is a Foreign Place, came together. And so it was really about looking at something more than herself, something bigger than herself, and something bigger than even her collection. It's really about journeying together with artists and creating a space where culture becomes as essential as health, as survival, and all of these things. There's actually I don't know if it's a true or fake story, but there's a story about Winston Churchill, that one of his generals comes to him during the war saying that, you know, we might need to take more funds out of education and art because we need it more for security and military backup. And he's like, then what are we fighting the war for? And so to see culture as really integral, is really essential to people being together, I think is where art here and setting up an art space or art foundation is really for those experiences that can be shared, and they're as essential as perhaps health, care, and education.
Yeah, I think in Mr. Munjal's case, I still remember because when I started, there was no foundation, and there was this huge list of names made for what should we call it. And obviously one of the names I suggested, seeing the trend, was his surname, Munjal Foundation. And he said, no, there's no way, this is not about me, it's about society. And I don't want to make it about myself. It's about creating an institution that outlives me and my family. We want to create something that sets the tonality for when you do something, do you really need to talk about why you're doing it or how you're doing it? And I think that difference is what we've kept within the organization. He has various philanthropic initiatives, like Zain said, from healthcare to education. And it's very rare that he mentions them because his idea of philanthropy is something that's not spoken about. A lot of times when he's actually being put out there is because I force him to, because I think both our people should be seen as models and examples of how things can be done. Not saying that they're not other people who are doing it really well, but this is a different way of doing things. And it's important to see that there is an alternate, and there, you can question status quo more than once.
Can I add something to this, which is that it's also, when you set up a name that's different and bigger than yourself, it makes other people feel like they can be part of it. They're more stakeholders, more shareholders in a sense. And it feels like, yeah, there's someone who has a cause or a mission, and I also want to share that, as opposed to, oh, this is a family project, which of course, with all due respect, those that have done it with their names are doing much more than just creating family legacy. But I think just as a gesture, it automatically suggests more people to want to share a vision. Yes, exactly.
And your locations are interesting. I mean, of course, Dubai was clear, it was an opportunity for Smriti to give back to her second home and her home for the last 40 years, where she made her life. And of course, the foundation, Serendipity Art Foundation, is also based in Delhi, but Goa is a very specific location. And I wonder how your locations have influenced the structuring and the programming of the institutions. I mean, the festival takes place in Goa, but you have ongoing continual programming in Delhi and in other parts of India, in collaborations and partnerships. But have these locations influenced how you structure the programming and the needs that your programming and the structure of the institution responds to?
Let's go with Goa first, because I mean, this goes back so long into history.
And Sabih, you've been a part of Serendipity, so you know what Goa means to us. When we started the festival, everybody told us do it in Delhi, it's your hometown, etc., etc. The intention was not to, like Sabih said, home itself is a very problematic term. So it wasn't to do it in your hometown. We also wanted to use it as a pilot to prove that there were economies involved with culture that could benefit states. And so when we moved to Goa as a state, which had the infrastructure to support tourism, we could actually engage with creative placemaking. The space itself lent to becoming a festival city. We've seen examples of Edinburgh, we've seen examples of Venice, and we wanted to try a model where we could actually bring the city to life with arts and culture. It becomes a city of art and culture for those many days. And that allowed us to experiment with sight. And it allowed us to experiment with non-conventional forms of art making. Sabih actually did this amazing project for us. He curated a project called Ground Beneath My Feet that we had done on a barge. We parked it on a naval jetty, and believe me, permissions are not easy in India for anything. I think that project was a marker for us to say what can be done in a place like Goa. How do you kind of question the land and the water? But I'll let Sabih talk a little bit about the project, because that is one of our favorite projects and really the pride of Serendipity.
I mean, and a huge moment of pride for me, because it opened so many ideas which actually connect with Dubai as well. The Ground Beneath Our Feet was a project that collaborated with HH Art Spaces in Goa, a space that was founded by very renowned contemporary performance artists Nikhil Chopra, Romain Losteur, and Madhvi Gore. And together with that art space and Serendipity Arts and Asia Art Archive, where I was working, we put together this project of really looking at the barge as a site that is not necessarily grounded and landed, but looking at the sea as a frontier. And on this, over the period of the festival, the barge transformed every day, with new performances taking place, and the site kept transforming. It's a little bit like a ship of Theseus, where the ship on its journey keeps changing its parts. And as it changes, is it still the same ship once all the parts have been changed? And that's a question we may ask ourselves too, that as we keep changing as human beings, are we still the same, or are we something else, or are we both? And I think it captured that sense of embodiment and change in a beautiful way, which then brings me to Ishara, that, it's interesting that both of our cities and sites are port cities. And there's this really interesting design theorist, Keller Easterling, who says that port cities are often frontiers for futures. And it's no coincidence that the recent film by Christopher Nolan, Tenet, is also set on port cities and free zones. And so the relationship with port cities and futures, and that being a site for cutting edge contemporary art, I think is a really interesting space to think about. Not landlocked areas, but sea-facing frontiers. And this brings us to Dubai in a sense that it's a place, like I mentioned, where there's such a high traffic of people, ideas, communities, languages, foods, and then setting up a space for contemporary art. How does one even think about representation? One has to blend in all kinds of complex ways. And to me, I think Ishara has that possibility of looking at the world through itineraries rather than inventories. That you draw out itineraries of contemporary art. What are the circuits in which contemporary art moves and contemporary ideas transform, not as which art belongs to which place through territories. And I think at Ishara that informs, our location really informs our programming and ideas for exhibitions and programs.
And with that in mind, like what belongs where, and what ideas belong to which periods and histories and places. Decolonizing museums and institutions has become a concern, and in many places and cases an urgency recently. And when we think about reckoning with the systems by which we frame and perpetuate and disseminate art, culture, history, this is really pertinent to the region that you focus on, obviously. And there are inherited institutional models across India and the subcontinent. Sabih, maybe this is feels less of a priority in context of the UAE and Dubai, although of course our region also had, the whole of the Gulf had a presence of external people over the periods of its history. But I know this is something that you both reflect on, and maybe in some cases even interrogate personally as practitioners, but also through your institutions. So can you talk to us a little bit about reinventing models for where you are and for sharing cultures here, and what informs the process of reinvention? Yeah, it's a
I go first? Or
yeah,
sure.
go.
Smriti? Yeah, okay. So, well, one thing, even touching on Smriti's Serendipity Art Festival site of Goa, you realize that the world has not only seen one history of colonization, but multiple histories of colonization, from the Portuguese to the Francophone to the Anglophone, like all of those, right? And therefore, decolonization is not just a decolonization from some notion of a homogeneous West. There's in fact so many layers of decolonizing, and including internal decolonizations. So there's an interesting meme actually I saw about that said something on the lines that you can't decolonize institutions without decolonizing the world. And how I sort of thought of that was, you begin decolonizing in a way with your bookshelf, right? Or with things around you, things really in your immediate surrounding. And this then comes to actually, how do we even define decolonizing art spaces or art foundations? And I think one central idea that we have to think about is how art institutions can move away from the project of civilizing the world, because such an important part of colonization was civilization. How do we civilize the brutes, right? How do we civilize the uncivilized? And the fact of the matter is, there's just so many knowledges all over. And so how do we draw from those knowledges? How do we learn from them? How do we make them a currency which speaks and creates a shared history of the world? And the other part, in relation to decolonization, something that actually Charles Esche is very aware of with the Van Abbe Museum, is looking at decentralizing as well. It's not just decolonizing, but decentralizing. So in a way, for Ishara, how do you look at contemporary art from South Asia, not in South Asia, but elsewhere in the world? And so Dubai becomes that off-center, decentered space of looking at South Asian contemporary art. And here, therefore, we can make connections happen, which otherwise, even in South Asia, are becoming increasingly difficult because of border politics and things. And my last point about this is to think about not only decolonizing, but also thinking of forms of recoding. So once you decolonize, what do you get? You need to find recoding, new ways of talking about art, thinking about regions. And I think at Ishara, a lot of our thought and process goes into learning from artistic processes and how institutions can learn from them, as opposed to being the civilizing, colonizing force of, we'll tell you how to do things, we'll tell you how to show art. In fact, artists can also teach us how art, dialogues, culture can thrive.
And your publics as well, but this is
Absolutely.
another.
Yes, very true.
I think for us, and I completely agree with Sabih, I think it's so eloquently put. I mean, I rather listen to you than talk at this point, but I'm going to try and put a couple of points across. You know, when we started Serendipity Arts Foundation, and most art organizations in South Asia look for validation. So we wanted to check a couple of boxes. We wanted to look for validation, not from the outside, but the inside. Being in India with the kind of population we have, the kind of disparity we have, which kind of led to the idea of access and exclusion. What does access and exclusion mean in trying to decode colonization? You know, how do you create access which is all encompassing? How does your access not gentrify, but actually allow people to engage with dissent? And I think those have been the tools that we have used. One of the most important tools that we've used, because you know this has been such a big topic of discussion all through college, school. I must tell you that even through architecture, decolonizing architecture, you know, how do you build, has been a huge topic in this part of the world, and we really haven't come up with great solutions around it. I think governance models is what needs to change. So when we started the foundation and we tried to set up governance models, they were very inclusive. We wanted to take voices and not fit people into ready silos. And was that possible then to bring access back into the foundation? I think what we're really, really proud of is that when we talk about the festival, it is a free festival that is accessible to all. We do not have a board that says, rights for admission reserved. We don't want people to feel that they need to be someone to be able to accept the festival. And that's really the ground up working that we're trying to, instead of going top down, we're trying to say, okay, what is it that we can create within our governance structures, within our access structures, to allow it first be for the public, and then see what it really means to take the next step to the future.
And in fact, I would say about Serendipity, something that we're also quite aware of is that one move towards decolonization in various places tends to be indigenization. You start going into looking at the so-called artisanal and craftsmanships and things like that. And that sometimes tends to fetishize it, which is very much the way colonization went about it, through anthropology, ethnography. Whereas actually with Serendipity, you can see so much fusion happening, so much contemporaneizing, finding contemporary support for artisanship, craftsmanship that still exists in the country, is still living. And I think at Ishara also, with the different artists we want to work, we want to think of the contemporary relationship between cultures, traditions, modernity. So it's speaking from the now and unpacking those things.
Yeah. Well, the interdisciplinarity of both your programs is a sort of small step towards decolonizing in itself, you know, for a region where the arts were never categorized, and that was really a British imposition to the arts in India, where everything had to be sort of sculpture and art. You know, this return to it all coming together in a really organic way is a very natural, organic first step. And the fact that neither of you are museums and have this very pliant, porous structure and approach to a program, I suppose is a liberating factor in itself. And I wonder, do you experiment, and are you still experimenting with breaking these logics of display? I think every time I come and see a new exhibition at Ishara, it feels very different. The space feels different. The sort of interpretation is fresh. So I know that's something you're interested in. Could you talk a little bit about those logics of representation and display?
Sabih, I will add to this, and then you shall have to answer the question, because I feel that with the latest exhibition at Ishara that you've done, you've actually broken the need for blank walls, right? So you've kind of changed the way people perceive blank walls, how museums have to be, how the objects are static, the objects don't move. They're there because they're supposed to be there. And then you kind of question the relationship between the object and the space. What is the transient nature of the object within a space like Ishara, which I think is fabulous. I mean, with Serendipity, we have the ease because we're a festival for 8 days and we keep coming back. So we can reinvent ourselves every year. But having a fixed space and then applying creative placemaking to that was quite amazing. So I would love to also hear about it.
Oh, thank you, Smriti. That's very kind of you. Well, I mean, if I can say a big hats off to Saurabh because of how he brings together his process. And as I was mentioning earlier, that we try and learn from artistic methodologies as a way to re-educate ourselves as an institution or foundation. And that's just so illuminating because in a way, if you think about it, artists are so ahead of things, you know? It's just the discursive field around them that we have to create as foundation people or as curators. So with the space right now and what his exhibition is doing, we had the privilege and pleasure of working with Saurabh to come and curate an exhibition that opened in January 2021. It was called Growing Like a Tree. It was looking at artistic networks, collective journeys, and how it brings all of those together. And over the summer, especially after the second wave, we went back to Saurabh saying that, listen, from growing like a tree, we have to think about growing it like a forest rather than just doing a change of exhibitions. And so at the Ishara space, Saurabh conceives, along with a number of artists, this kind of transformation over 6 days. So over 6 days, the show keeps transforming. And you know, there's a beautiful saying by Teju Cole where he says that if you go into a forest and you say, I like this tree and I like that one, it makes no sense. It's a strange way to talk about a forest. So you're basically experiencing a forest, a density, which in fact, if I may also add, draws inspiration from Dainita Singh, who is one of the persons that this exhibition pays homage to because of how she supported artists. And here she's looking at the still image and undoing that, unpacking that into form clusters, into forming kinds of new permutations and combinations. So the exhibition space becomes a space of permutations, combinations. And we hope with every exhibition, we can reinvent ourselves as an institution. So in a way, if the barge was one kind of a site at Serendipity, now Ishara is a vessel where artists can test ideas, and hopefully museums around the world can take inspiration from it.
That was really beautiful.
Thank you.
In terms of vessels, both of your institutions operate differently in that, although Sunil also has a collection, this is not Serendipity Art Foundation, and the festival is not a collection-oriented institution. It's more a sort of collection of people and investment in practitioners and capacity building. And on the other hand, Smita has been building one of the most important collections of Indian art anywhere for the last 20 years. And yet there is now a different shift within it, since it's Ishara draws from it for its displays and its exhibitions. And as a result, it is not wholly a private collection anymore. It has other directions it can take and responsibilities it can bear. And I wonder if you both can talk about not being a museum and what these having a collection and not having a collection implies and bestows. Sabih, maybe you can talk a little bit about the shift within the collection from public to private.
Smita, like I mentioned, has been collecting contemporary art from India over the past 20 years. And when she founded Ishara Art Foundation, it was from the very beginning, from its inception, about South Asian contemporary art. And in fact, one of the conversations Smita and I had when I was joining Ishara was, is Ishara dedicated entirely to your collection? And she says, no, in fact, it has to be bigger. And in fact, I would also want to learn from it. And so it's been a lot of synergy in us discussing. And while I'm developing a strategy for Ishara with Smita and my colleagues, we're also therefore realizing that we're building a strategy for the collection, because the collection is no more just a private endeavor. There are so many synergies. And in fact, Smita recently gave an interview where she beautifully described upon the interviewer's question as, what are the artists she collects? And her response was, the artists that I'm journeying with. And so you can see that the collection building is happening as a sharing of a journey, supporting certain artistic practices. And a lot of those artistic practices are now beyond just India, and they're looking at South Asian contemporary art. And so among the pillars at Ishara, when we organize shows or programs, they include not just works or artists in the collection, but sometimes much beyond. And it starts in a way the other way around, whereas many foundations might get set up with the collection at the heart, and then the institution builds around that. In fact, now with the institution set up, now we're seeing how the collection strategy can be channeled in synergy. And this sort of becomes a way for us to be much more agile as a foundation, so that we can see the changing field of contemporary art and respond to it both as a foundation curatorially and as a collector. If you want to know a little bit about Smita's collection, while there is a wide diversity of artists and practices, you can see that at least over the past years, there's a strong leaning towards works on paper and photographic works, but also works that push the boundaries of those respective mediums. So how can we think of paper not just as a drawing and secondary to painting, but artists who deal with paper as their primary medium? Also a direction we're seeing increasingly is towards conceptual art. So both photography and conceptual art haven't really gotten or garnered the kind of support that they have in South Asia. And we're seeing ourselves actually championing that to some extent.
Thank you, Sabih. And Smriti, I think really you collect practices and people and lens. That's when I think about serendipity, that's what I think. Can you tell us more?
Actually, Mr. Munjal's collection, so when I joined him as an archiver and someone to look after his collection. And so whenever we went to acquire a piece of art, he never did it because of what that art was valued at. He did it because he was extending support to the artist. And that really intrigued me. I mean, in my prior life, I archived a collection which were almost historic documents, and then people collect them to kind of document history. But with Mr. Munjal, it was always about support to the person who needs it. And that's why I feel that his philanthropic initiatives are very clear. It's about extending support to the person who needs it most. And you're so right, Zain. We don't collect, we support. We've had many arguments saying that, oh, we're now 5 years old, should we have our own collection? But if I had a bunch of money to buy art, we would rather invest in capacity building than actually acquire something. Because I think that goes a long way. Even though sometimes the projects are a miss, I think the learnings for the project for everyone involved are so large that we can't table it against having something in our collection. So Mr. Munjal's collection is actually quite fabulous, but currently it's his collection. And as a tough taskmaster as he is, when we started, he said, you have nothing, you're starting on ground zero. So don't expect me to give you something to say, oh, here's something to start with. So we actually built practices. And given the fact that we're slightly different from Ishara, we don't look at only visual arts, we look at all the genres, including performing arts. It became more important for us to understand what support meant. And for us, support meant various things. Can you support the artist in maybe getting the finances in order? Can you help them with project management? How do they improve artistic practice? So yeah, that's really, I wouldn't call it support. I would probably, I would probably say that it's more of his investment into the community that will bring about change.
I think
so critical that we've been thinking about capacity building for a region that has an extraordinarily rich community of practitioners of all kinds. And it's not to say that there aren't art schools and historical programs, of course there are in India, but relative to the scale that we've been discussing and relative to the appetite, there just aren't the institutions to meet the demographics that are interesting. So in terms of capacity building, which is so important, what are some of your strategies for that? Because I know it's something you both as institutions think about. And you've already addressed that, Smriti, through this supporting of artists, thinking about their finances. No one teaches them how to do that. Not every artist can have a gallery relative to the size of the country. In India, for example, the gallery community is still fairly small. What are the ways in which you fill the gaps and the sort of responsibilities that you end up coming to bear to these communities?
I think I'll go back to the idea of access. It's not that there aren't enough great projects happening in the country or in South Asia. It's about what is their reach. Often we hear about great projects that stay within the artistic community. It doesn't step out of that. One of the projects that we are starting next year is an online academy where we're hoping to fill the gaps between education and practice. For example, documentary theater or looking at performance art. Why does performance art not feature in a curricula for an art school? Is it something that we can provide to young practitioners and to audiences to understand the genre of documentary theater, of writing in the arts? I mean, if you look at critical writing in the arts, which is so lacking in the country, what are the methods in which we can fill the gap? So like Serendipity, we're hoping that we find places that we plug ourselves in that fills the gaps in the system. It's a tall order. I don't know how much we'll reach and make do, but the intention is to identify the gaps and then try and create access for all. The other strategy that we worked very hard on is to start a publishing wing where we want to make publications that are accessible to all. We're looking at models in which text can be disbursed in the right way to the right people. It's very easy to say it's art text and it cannot be understood. Can writing then reinvent itself for a larger audience? And those are the kind of investigations that we're doing. We're coming out with a publication called imaginable worlds, art in crisis, with the Smart Museum at the University Chicago Press. Because last year we realized that all artistic communities during the pandemic went through a very similar upheaval, and we talked about it only in our own space. Is it possible then to put text together that makes people understand that we're all going through the same problems, and sometimes sharing those problems evolves great innovations? And so those are the kind of small strategies that we're trying to start in the next couple of years.
And with amazing scales, Smriti. I think that's the thing with Serendipity. The scale is just so inspiring. In our case, I think, well, we're starting out and we're more modest in scale, but one thing that we are committed to is education. And so a lot of collaborations with universities, and therefore a certain kind of capacity building in terms of just, young people coming out, aspiring to be in the art world in various capacities in a rapidly changing art field. And so workshopping with artists, talks, programs. In fact, we've done a few, like I've done it before joining Ishara with Serendipity, and we continue to do various organizations, and whether it's on writing, whether it's on critical thinking, whether it's on specific themes, archiving in the contemporary arts. And at Ishara itself, I think the idea of doing the show that we've got going on right now, for instance, with Growing Like a Tree, it's really giving a platform for really young and emerging contemporary artists, some of whom have not even had exhibitions before, to be showing in an international kind of context. And then what are the dialogues that develop from there? So there's a certain informality that I would say at Ishara in terms of the kinds of capacities for art that we can expand. And with regard to at least the collection side of this, I wanted to add, which kind of fits in here, is that besides, of course, what Ishara as a space show is presenting and exhibiting, the Prabhakar and the Ishara Art Foundation collection also gets shared, and we reach out to various museums that are invested in contemporary art so that they might want to borrow from the collection. And again, our location in Dubai brings some more access or ease of access to it. So I think in terms of capacity building, ours is somewhat more informal. And as we're growing, I think we're going to be channeling out our routes for that.
You both touched on something now in both your responses that I wanted to ask you about as well. Smriti, you mentioned that you had embarked on this publishing project with two international collaborators. And, there's something looking beyond the digital, I don't know how all your text was disseminated. I think some of it was physical, but a lot of it was digital. And Sabih, I know that partnerships are critical as well to the way you're going to be working going forward. I wanted to, and I hear this from institutions everywhere now, absolutely all over the world. I think we understand we can't be experts on all these different geographies, but we have more of a responsibility to reflect global interests. We're also connected. Can you tell us a little bit about this emphasis on partnerships, which I know certainly Serendipity has been working on for a long time? That's one question. And then, because I'm conscious of time, your digital programming and the need that we have everywhere and forevermore, no doubt, to remain digital as much as we want to be in person. The fact that we've all developed virtual habits, virtual expectations. There are two levels at which programming needs to function now, the in-person and the virtual. So first, partnerships. Sorry to throw two questions at you.
So we, like Zain, you said, we don't know it all, and we learn from collaborations. When we started the festival, it was about collaborations, collaborating with Zain, collaborating with Sabih, and we've had people who've become family for us, because it's very important to engage in a discourse that leads to certain solutions that you could attempt. We have collaborations around the world. We have tried to keep it very equal between the East and the West, within India, within South Asia. But what that has done for us, it has allowed us to bring technology closer to people. Actually, I could answer both the questions in the same thing, because it's allowed us to understand what are the changes happening in the West that we could accommodate faster in the East. and how that affects artistic practice. One of the biggest problems we realized is that the technology comes to you faster on your phone than it reaches the artistic community. And now we're talking about a hybrid world, and then how do you fill that gap? It goes back to capacity building. They say that in India, half the population by 2030 will have mobile phones, but I question access. So when we look at hybrid models in India, I question what happens to my entire vision of access. Last year with the pandemic, we were missing the festival. We decided to embark on a virtual festival where we insisted that our artists work with tools they weren't familiar with. Some of the outcomes were phenomenal. We work with cyber theater. We work with WhatsApp as a project because that's become so easy in India to communicate with. And we tried to find new modes because we wanted to reinvent site. If we didn't have a physical site and our site was the internet, it wasn't about streaming a project. It wasn't watching it on Netflix, but how does it create engagement? And that comes with collaboration, technology, and new learning. Collaboration for us has also been able to express shared histories in the South Asian region and beyond. I think histories which are often missed and not talked about, histories which are not documented. Collaborations are great archives for us. I think the conversations I've had with Sabih, the conversations Zain, you and I had for the creative placemaking symposia, I think those have contributed not only to thought for the institution, but for the thought for artists. And what is then the future of artistic practice in a volatile world like ours? What do you mean by hybrid? And what is the balance between virtual and real? What is the balance between access and not access? And how do you take the idea of assembly to a virtual space? And I think for me, all of this is interconnected because I don't think any of this can exist without the other. I think without collaborations, and for me, collaborations is institutions, individuals, passionate people who just want to be a part of it, our volunteers, everyone's a collaborator for us because everyone has an opinion that needs to be heard. So that's the way we really look at the whole thing. I hope it answered your question.
I think it also answered mine. I mean, I think collaboration partnerships is very much at the DNA, even at Ishara, while we do things in very much the way you described, Smriti. And while it may be easy to say that we're all networked and the world is connected, there is a default condition to that. Sure, the world is connected, but collaboration suggests what kind of solidarities you want to form, what kind of people, thoughts, ideas you want to bring together and work with. And I think that way is even at Ishara, we're always seeking those out, but we're also being discerning, discretionary as to what kind of dialogues we want to have. And therefore, dialogues in Dhaka, dialogues in Colombo and Jaffna, dialogues in somewhere in Islamabad, dialogues here in the Gulf. So how those different sites or networks, so to speak, are voluntarily drawn together based on our intent. And, coming to the question of technology, I think every technology produces a new we. The framework of the we, the circumference of the we changes with new technological models. A mobile phone creates a very different community that may not have existed before the mobile phone. Right. And that way is, I think, with Ishara, we're looking at technology being a complement, not a binary between physical and virtual, but rather how virtual can complement the physical and vice versa. So not ever thinking of substituting one with the other. And having worked at AAA before this, one realizes that it's very easy to dismiss digital technologies and say analog is the best. But by that logic, you're basically saying the only archive that counts is the Getty archive, and every other archive is not really valid, or the British Museum is the only valid museum. And I think in Asia, we have to think about technologies, strategies of dissemination. So with us, we've collaborated and partnered with Colombo Scope in the recent past, with Chobi Mela, with various kinds of small and big spaces and initiatives, not to mention our partnerships with, say, the MoMAs and the Tates, where we've also done collaborative programs. So we're looking at balancing these and through solidarities in a way.
And you both referenced several times, and particularly you, Sabih, collaborating with Chobi Mela, working with Colombo, Dhaka. When we were having this discussion about this panel today, there was an intention to think about South Asia as opposed to just as opposed to India. You're both Indian, both your founders are Indian. One of you are based in India. You're here. I mean, obviously, Dubai is an extremely international place, but you continue, both your programs continue to engage artists across the region as a matter of priority and as a sort of inherent and sort of natural thing to do. And I think it's very generous. I think we are global, and the art world and the culture world is global. However, regionally, we have a lot of complexity, and we are less, it's not as easy as one would imagine to undertake this. So I think it's a beautiful commitment, and it's a generous commitment to define yourself, particularly Ishara, as a foundation for South Asia. And I was wondering, we have a little bit more time. I think it's a beautiful way on which to wrap up and think about that as a priority. And I think for Serendipity as well, maybe it's less overt, but absolutely you've always maintained this thread throughout the programming. So if you can talk about that.
A very good question, and I think a very important one. It's really at the heart of what we do at Ishara, very consciously, that I think there's a need for recognizing complex geographies. That geographies are not insular, places are not insular, they're connected to other places. And so at Ishara, I think we're looking at those. And, you know, if I were to connect this back to Smita, who's the founder, because these are conversations we have together as well. And she says she grew up in so many cities because her parents worked in the railway. So she would be taking trains from one place to the other all the time, living in different cities all the time. And so it's, even in the founder and here at Ishara, we're constantly looking at what I mentioned as itineraries. So while we say, and our motto is about presenting contemporary art for South Asia, which is constituted by India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, and Nepal, our exhibitions, our programming are constantly creating cross-cultural, cross-regional dialogues. Our current exhibition, for instance, we have artists from Myanmar, Singapore, Cambodia, Germany, Australia in a show and in a space which is dedicated to South Asian contemporary art. And we hope this also paves models, because artistic practice is so much more complicated. It navigates across these geographies. So I think it's also not just a mission of representing South Asia, but in fact, debating, complicating, recognizing the new complexities of South Asia, and thereby even the world at large. Because it's not just therefore to look at the complexity of South Asia, but look at the complexity of Europe, look at the complexity of America and Africa. And the last point I want to make just in relation to this is actually this famous quote from American saxophonist John Coltrane, if you remember. He says that I like to start in the middle of a sentence and move in both directions at once. I think at Ishara, being placed where we are, we want to start in the middle of a sentence, not start from the civilizational history or the future. Start right in the middle of a sentence and move in both directions at once.
I've never heard that, but I'm never going to forget it. That's very poetic and beautiful, Sabih. And I think, of course, I mean, Dubai makes perfect sense for that. And it is extraordinary that Ishara is the only foundation, arts foundation for South Asia in the world, given what we are diasporically, the scale of what we represent as a regional people. It's really, it's impressive, it's important. Smriti, do you have...
Serendipity's done the Young Subcontinent, which was so amazing, I remember.
Yeah, I was going to say that, actually. Thank you, Sabih. The thing is that with Serendipity, we don't want to, while we work a lot with the South Asian region and beyond, I mean, we've had a lot of international participation in our 7 years of existence. We didn't want to kind of typecast ourselves to a region because we find boundaries very problematic. I mean, to say, when we say the Look Stranger under the Subcontinent project that Sabih mentioned, and we were having a conversation with our curator, Rahab Alana, who started this amazing project called Another South Asia, which is a whole new discussion, which we should speak about another time. But he questioned that. He said, when you say the subcontinent, what do you really mean? Or when you say South Asia, what are your boundary lines? And then is it the South Asian mindset? Is it when you belong to South Asia? And we had critical issues, like supposing we were launching a grant for South Asia and somebody was South Asian by DNA and heritage, but they were living in London. Do they qualify if they've never lived in South Asia as South Asians? And so we kind of let go of the terminology because it became very problematic after a point. And we said that, okay, we are Serendipity and the intention is to support practice. And we want to have cross-cultural conversations. And we don't want to limit ourselves to geographies because we realize that shared histories around the world, basically after India went through liberalization, is so huge. It becomes very difficult to put things into silos. Our attempt at Serendipity is to break all silos and to not have any divisions. Is that possible? Is that not? It's a question that can be answered in the next couple of years. The intention is not to close off any conversation in the future.
Well, I'm very conscious that we are wrapping up in 1 minute and 30 seconds. I have so many more questions I want to ask you. Luckily, I can do that off stage, but I hope that we have another opportunity. This has been such a pleasure, and there are endless ideas packed into this hour that we've had together. Thank you so much. I think we're going to be rejoined by Awada, Victoria. Thank you. Thank you, Sabih, so much. I hope we get to revisit Serendipity in person and that becomes an easier thing to do in the months to come. I'll let Victoria.
Thank you, Zain, and lovely Smriti. Always so nice to meet.
Thank you so much, everyone, for such inspiring conversation. And to bounce back on what you just said, we also hope within the conversation room that this break boundaries and mindset to reach out to all the listener on the online viewing room. Thank you so much to all, and see you soon for the next conversation.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.